The Giant Killers by Conway Fitzgerald. Chapter 2.
127 years had passed since my mother's death, since that day I left the mill. In that time, I had grown into a woman and had come to enjoy a much more comfortable and exciting life with Thebkaru. We had created a secret underground fortress right beneath the city of Bishopsgate. It was constructed brilliantly and was totally undetectable by the humans. This hideaway housed our Thieves' Guild headquarters, which, thanks to Theb, had established me as its leader. We were a tight-knit and very successful criminal organization, having generated a tremendous amount of wealth over the last century. Most of the miscreants Theb employed during my adolescence assumed that I was his daughter. But the other elves, partial elves, and most of the halflings knew better. They could see my ancestry was that of the wood elves, as the copper tone of my skin betrayed. My red hair and freckles were also most uncommon to elves. Clearly, I was of mixed human race. Only the dark elves, it seems, feared their females enough to accept them as leaders. But all guild members feared the cloak, nearly as much as the humans of the mill had. And I was under his protection. That made them dutiful, if not completely loyal to my command. Under Theb's watchful tutelage, I had become proficient in not only the ways of stealth, but also sword and magic use. Theb was a skilled assassin and sorcerer, and had taught me much. I had become quite powerful. Also, I thought, powerful enough, at least, to keep me in charge of my guild and free from the gaze of the humans I was amidst and stealing from, at least for a time. The human population of what was then known as the Three Kingdoms had swelled in size and broadened its borders in every direction. With each passing year, ever more humans migrated west from the distant reaches of the known world in search of new farmlands and in flight of the East's endless wars. Humankind had become increasingly more proficient in the art of war and the use of magic. Their gods were truly powerful and granted them increasing blessings by way of visions and good fortune. For every new adversity that brought hardship to other races, there were 2 new blessings that aided the humans in their hasty reproduction and rapid growth of power. Their outworldly gods seemed ever active in their efforts to tilt the scales in their favor. Though there were many competing clergies now forming, each with their own champion heroes and philosophical bent. New churches seemed to crop up overnight, sprouting new villages around them, until they were everywhere in the Sharmal River Valley. Humankind had overpowered and consumed the land from all the other humanoids. Their rule in what was once the ancestral home of the elves was now without question here. Mankind's fear, greed, and violence had driven all other races far away from them, deep into the forests and hills, until more men followed and forced them away further still. Bishopsgate was the largest human town in the far west, and its governor still tolerated the presence of other races, such as elves, halflings, and dwarves. The humans of the west had concentrated their violence on purging these lands of the darker, more hostile humanoid races, such as the orcs, goblins, gnolls, ogres, and trolls. Thirst for gold, new fertile plantations, and other underground treasures pushed mankind's reach ever further to the south and west. They were now venturing into the high mountains beyond the borderlands, towards the jagged cliffs of Land's End. That was still a place that no man yet dared tread, for that was the ancestral homeland of the giants, who had also retreated after their last defeat, but were still rumored to exist. I was very happy then, doing what I was doing. The world, however cruel and dangerous, made sense to me. I had found my purpose and my place. We were hidden magnificently among the humans, behind their secure walls, able to use their stability to our own advantage. I would have been content to live the rest of my life this way. It was then I came to know Dan Tanuvial. When I first saw him, he was just a boy, about 9 or 10 years old. He was filthy, hungry, emaciated, and tired. He had wandered for weeks, alone, on foot. His home of Alenor, the small keep 100 miles to the southwest, had been sacked, and all of its inhabitants killed mercilessly, save one. Dan was the youngest son of Ulrich Tanuvial, lord and overseer of the keep near the borderlands called Alenor. It was a small stronghold that was a key store point for treasures being mined and gathered from the western mountains for delivery east to Torbana and the palace of King Owen. Alenor was among the very few permanent western outposts yet constructed at that time. The fighting men of Alenor were notoriously skilled, as they had to be, considering their station. There were many dangerous monsters, humanoids, cults, and other violent criminal cadres all around them, all looking to pilfer their recently discovered treasures. But one gloomy morning, the small village and keep was overrun by the least likely of invaders, a gathering of orc clans. Orcs are a grotesque form of humanoid. Elvish legend tells they are the spawn of a pig demon, the demigod Urtox, who disguised himself, tricked and defiled elvish, dwarvish, and human women, much as Pule had done with my own mother. Their offspring created a race of humanoid that was bent on destruction, but unable to gather in great numbers due to their own selfish and chaotic nature. Usually this made orc bands fairly easy prey to platoons of well-trained fighting men. However, on this day, they came in numbers that Alenor had never seen before. They were organized and executed a carefully planned attack. This was the event that began the Western War and begot our quest to destroy the giants. Alenor was small, but a well-constructed keep that was built strategically atop a squarish hill. A road ran through it to the west. It then split towards Melandon and the Sharmal Valley to the southeast, and to the northeast towards Bishop's Gate. There were several farms spread out along these dirt roads, and a trader's village just outside the walls. The town consisted of about 180 humans, with a contingent of roughly 20 armored fighting men. The morning prayers at the shrine to Tyr had just begun when it was interrupted by screams echoing in the valley. The priest did not stop his prayer, but Ulrich stood up and went to see what was going on. His 3 sons followed. From the high point atop the Barbican, they could see the whole village below. Smoke was bellowing from the farms along the horizon. Women and children were seen running towards the keep, with bloodthirsty orcs chasing after them.
"Father, look,"
said Ulrich's eldest son, Arfel. He pointed to the southern road, which was filling with farming serfs, fleeing the orcs and hoping for salvation within the keep.
Swine, bastards!
Yelled Ulrich.
Arfel, Peter, ready your horses.
Their father commanded confidently. By the time they were equipped and their horses readied, a front had already formed outside the main gate. Some of Alinor's best men were already battling dozens of orcs that had gathered outside the gate. Ulrich's men could not fire their arrows, as the terrified civilians were among them. They begged and pleaded for them to open the gate, as the orcs beat them with their spiked clubs and stabbed them with their wooden spears.
Break them. Drive them back so we can get those people in here,
commanded Ulrich to his 2 elder sons. The gate came open, and there was a sudden surge of screaming people and snarling orcs forcing their way in. Just as some of the fleeing peasants had been shot by friendly arrow fire, several more were blasted aside and then trampled by the charge of the war horses that burst out from the gate. Ulrich's 2 older sons led about 8 horsemen into the battle. The orcs found themselves totally outclassed. They fled in both directions of the road.
Arfel, take your men and secure the southern road. I'll take these,
his brother Peter said with great zeal. Because a large orc tribe may contain about 20 fighting males, it was reasonable to assume that these confused orcs had only now realized they'd bit off more than they could chew. Peter's horsemen hacked them down easily as the orcs showed them their backs in full flight. But then, from out of the woods to each side of the road, emerged dozens more orcs, wielding human-constructed bows. They fired the first volley, and the lightly armored horsemen were caught in a hail of arrow fire. Peter saw many of his men get dropped, but decided to continue charging the orcs' line. As he charged closer, he noticed even greater numbers of well-armed orcs emerging from the wood. There were hundreds of them. As he cried out for a retreat, his horse was struck in the chest with an arrow, and he crashed into the ground beneath his fallen steed. His leg had been shattered, but he managed to pull himself from the horse and continue the fight. But Peter and his remaining men were completely surrounded and soon overrun beneath a wanton beating of spiked clubs. Ulrich and his best men had fought off the other orcs that were foolish enough to attempt to enter the keep. He returned to the barbican. It was then he saw that his sons and all of his horsemen were lost. Around them, coming from the north and the west, were hundreds of orcs marching towards the keep. He looked to his left and saw his youngest son, Dan, firing an arrow towards the charging mob of angry orcs.
Dan, go with your mother,
demanded Ulrich. After he had ordered his other sons into the fray and to their deaths, Dan was now his only son that remained alive. The youngest Tanuvial restrung his bow defiantly.
Father, I must battle with you. I am ready. I am not afraid.
Ulrich had made a plan to evacuate his family if he had ever been overrun by brigands. He never dreamed it would be this way, but he did not have much time. He swatted the bow down from the boy's hands.
Dan, I command you. I am your father and your lord. Go with your mother, get to Bishop, and alert them an orcish horde has formed. Hurry!
Despite his order, Dan continued to follow his father. Orcish arrows tipped with fire were now raining down upon the small keep. Ulrich stopped amidst the screaming chaos within, lowered himself to one knee, and grabbed his son by both shoulders. The fury in his eyes burned greater than the fires that had spread throughout the keep.
You must deliver this message. The orcs have gathered. Deliver this message. I command it. Do you understand me?
Yes, Father.
Dan relented. Before he could say goodbye, he was whisked away frantically with his mother and 2 sisters. They were led to an underground passage by a couple of the keep's best men. Dan held his baby sister's hand, trying to comfort her as she was crying intensely on his mother's shoulder. When they reached the end of the dark passage, dug beneath the ground, the noise of the attack grew silent. The trusted guardsman pushed unsuccessfully on the door at the end of the passage. As he kicked the door, Dan's other sister pressed close to him.
I'm afraid,
Bithar said. She was still in her white nightgown, which was wet and muddy. She was shivering.
I'm with you. Don't be afraid. We're getting out of here.
Dan tried to reassure her, doing his best imitation of his courageous father and brothers. The guardsman then kicked the wooden door twice more, and it was forced open. Once again there was light, and they heard the terrible noise of war. The 2 guards exited first, turning to Dan, his mother and sisters, motioning for them to leave. They ran. Dan was first. He exited the passage, which led to a stone stairway hidden by shrubs and small trees. When he got to the top, he turned his head back towards the hillside and could see Alinor in flames. The gates were collapsing under the battering ram of the orcish horde. There were several ladders now filled with orcs, climbing over the wall and into the keep.
Go, now, into those woods ahead,
said the guardsman, pointing to a thicket of woods about 50 yards away. Dan emerged from the bushes. Just as he did, he came across an orc armed with a bow. The orc fired at Dan and just missed his head. He could hear the arrow whistle past his ear. There were several others. The orcs seemed to be waiting there for them, as if they knew of this escape hatch beforehand. The guards drew their swords and charged the ambush.
Run! Now!
Dan ran as fast as he could towards the woods. Several arrows whipped around him. He was very athletic and made it most of the way to the tree line when he heard a shriek of terror behind. His mother was stopped in the field with her 2 young daughters and yelled out to him.
No!
His mother and sister Bithar had been hit by arrows. Bithar was completely still and silent. She had been struck through the neck with an orc's arrow. Dan's mother squatted over her and then called out to him as more arrow fire buzzed around them.
Dan! Run, boy! Don't look back, just keep running. Do as your father commands. Deliver your father's message. Mother! I can't leave you!
Dan screamed out defiantly as several more arrows pierced the ground beside him. His mother looked back and saw the approaching orcs. They were running towards them, closing in fast, cackling with anticipation. Muti knew all hope for her own escape, and for her crying infant daughter was lost. She could only pray to her gods that Dan might somehow be spared this day. She looked into her son's eyes one last time and pleaded with him.
Avenge us!
She then turned away from him, clutching her daughter and awaiting her fate. More orcs were gathering and approaching them quickly, so Dan turned and fled into the woods with tears in his eyes. Soon after, he could hear the cries of his baby sister and defiant screams of his mother as the orcs converged on him. Fleeing danger defied every intense fighter instinct within him, but his father and mother had commanded him, and he loved them, so he did as he was told. Dan raced through the muddy fields of burning farms. The orcs had stopped chasing him, for they were only permitted to part from their leader so far. Somehow, they had been trained to coordinate and follow commands. This is how Dan was able to evade capture long enough to reach the northern road. As he started running down the muddy road in the rain, he saw several armored men on horseback approaching from the foggy road that led back to Alinor. But these were not his brothers or his father's men. But they were human, so Dan was going to call out to them for help until he noticed orcs on foot following closely behind them. Dan fled back into the woods instinctively and took cover. He didn't think that they saw him, but they stopped there, so he spied at them from behind a tree. He heard one of the men speak to the orcs.
"There is another, a boy. He ran away in this direction. Find him and kill him,"
commanded an armored horseman. The orcs snarled and entered the woods to each side. Dan fled again, and only by way of his incredible stamina that kept him running for hours. Far into the nightfall did he elude capture again. He hid in the woods under the veil of darkness, for he could run no further. Dan finally fell to exhaustion, collapsing into the thick moss and tall grass beside a rolling riverbed. He was awakened later that night to hear the howling of nearby battle wargs, large and vicious orc-tamed wolves, but he was unable to move any further. Dan placed his life into the hands of his gods and rested there until he fell to sleep. Throughout the night, he shivered uncontrollably beneath the cold rain that had hidden his scent. The traumatic events of that day repeated in his head during his nightmarish sleep. He awoke to the sun in his eyes, warming his cheek, which was being traversed by a snail. He sat up and pulled off the snail, the steam of his short breaths escaping his lips, which had now turned from pink to purple. He tried to stand, but his head was throbbing in pain, and he fell over as his wobbly legs gave way. The rain had stopped, and he managed to pull himself to a clearing by the river, which offered him some warming sunlight. He fell asleep again, and then awoke about an hour later, hungry and dehydrated. He drank from the stream desperately. Dan had survived the attack, but it was unlikely he could survive for long on the road alone. Yet after many days of wandering and scrounging in the woods along the road, wary of every passerby on horseback or carriage, he finally reached the outer walls of Bishop's Gate. However, the guardsmen at the city's gate would not receive him. They fended him off as a vagrant and sent him away. Dan noticed their gambesons bore the same insignia as the horsemen who had ordered the orcs. These men were not his allies. His father had been betrayed by Peltaver, the governor of the city. Young Dan was now certain of it. The Tavors and Tanuvials had a history of bitter rivalry. The city's governor, Peltaver, had long coveted Alinor's lands and the beautiful wife of Ulrich Tanuvial. Young Dan needed to keep his identity secret until he figured out how to fulfill his mother's wish, lest he be forever haunted by her last words to him.
Avenge us!
He managed to talk his way into the city by way of a merchant who fed and pitied him. Dan was now an orphan and had come alone to Bishopsgate for refuge, but found none. So he took to the streets as a common pickpocket and store thief, doing what he could to survive, sleeping on rooftops. Little did he know that he was in my territory, and my guild did not take kindly to unsanctioned acts of thievery. Herf, one of my best dwarvish lock-crackers, was the one who captured him. But it was not easy. Dan, though very young, possessed a startling will to survive. He had come a very long way on his own, and did not fall to capture as easily as the dwarf expected. For myself and my guild, it was another boring evening that we attempted to liven with a drinking party. The Havling entertainers stopped their song as Herf dragged the human boy thief into my meeting area. Dan struggled to escape Herf's clutches, and when he did, struck him fiercely in the face with his fist. Herf, a strong and stocky dwarf to be sure, was felled by the child's blow. He was stunned. The other members of the guild drew their weapons, but I stopped them.
Wait,
I yelled. They surrounded him, and he cast his head from side to side, breathing deeply, trying desperately to defend himself from certain death. I was impressed by his fight, but more by his beauty. I had never seen such a beautiful human in all of my life. His hair was platinum blonde and shined like gold, and his strong face was absolute perfection. I used a charm incantation to calm him, and then motioned for him to approach my guild throne.
what is your name, boy?
He stammered for words. His lips were dry and cracking. I handed him my cup, which he drank from, then realizing by its sour taste that it was wine, spit it out. The party of thieves all laughed. He looked to me defiantly.
I am Dan Tanuvial, son of Ulrich, and rightful lord to the west keep of Alenor.
After a moment of silence, the small hall once again burst into laughter. I waved my hand for them to stop.
So, Lord Dan, why then have you come to Bishop to steal from my bounty? Herfir tells me you've been taking bread from my bakers and fruit from my grocers. They are under my protection, so you are stealing from me.
I had heard reports that the west keep of Alenor had indeed been sacked, but I wanted to see for myself what this charming boy might say in his defense.
My father Ulrich.
He paused as his eyes swelled with tears.
Is the rightful Earl of the Keep. He was killed defending us. I wanted to fight alongside him. He made me leave when the orcs came. Orcs? Really? This far east? I wouldn't think they would dare. Alenor was home to at least 24 experienced fighting men. How could a family of orcs overwhelm such an installation? Are you sure, boy? Lord Dan?
My guild erupted in laughter again.
They came in the hundreds. They snarled like boars, but fought like men. My father and my brothers fought bravely. There were just too many. I was commanded by my father and mother to come here, so I did. You walked here? By yourself? From Alenor?
I asked, most dubiously. If he had indeed done that, he was truly a determined young man.
Yes, I came here to Bishop to gain arms as father asked. But Peltaver is a coward and a fool. His men turned me away. They've turned their back on my father and the gods. I'm sorry for taking from you. I was hungry. I have nothing left now but revenge.
The boy warrior cried out. The tears in his eyes spoke truth. This was no pickpocket's act. He spoke as a young man, duly educated by clergy of some kind. I felt pity for this boy in a way I never thought possible. I had no compassion for the humans of Bishop, for they were all a selfish and miserable lot. With that, I agreed with the boy.
Pell certainly is a sloth and a miscreant. That you have right. Do you know him?
I handed young Dan a skinned fruit. He bit into it, and after enjoying its sweetness and moisture, he spoke.
My father introduced me some years ago. I do not know him, but I know he will die by my hand.
Once again, the room erupted in laughter. I leapt down from my guild throne and squatted before him. I flung my curly red hair behind my head and attempted to look into his soul with my large sky-blue eyes. My charm hex seemed to calm him somewhat. I smiled.
I like you, Dan Tanuvial, Lord of Alinor. Come, eat and drink with me and my gang of scoundrels, and we will see to your revenge.
The room yelled out in festivity. The music recommenced. Theb was not a bit in agreement with my decision. He spoke to me in Elvish while we observed the starving boy, filling his face desperately with as much of our food as he could get his hands on.
Why do you take in this human trash? He will give up our position and sell us out to his own kind. You know this. He has seen this place. He must die.
Oh, come now, Theb. You heard him. He wants Pell dead. Don't we all? Besides, if he is heir to the land's west, then he may be worth a lord's ransom.
Theb was not impressed. It was his duty to protect me, and his sense of danger was unquestionable. But I must admit, I was smitten. This boy was not just beautiful, he was special, and I wanted to know why. That evening, young Dan ate until he was sick, having been deprived of good food for nearly a month. After vomiting, he ate again, and then some more, uncertain where or when his next meal might come. As the night drew on, some of the nastiest villains in my guild started feeding him alcohol and attempted to get him drunk so they could take advantage of him. I was just about finished hearing a job proposal from one of my contractors when I noticed I had lost track of the boy.
Get off me, swine scum!
I heard him yell. The half-orc Zulk, best among my muscle, and among my most notoriously deviant guild members, was atop the boy, with his orc genitalia exposed. Dan was now pretty drunk and had said some rather nasty racial slurs about the half-orc, so Zulk was attempting to have his way with him while his ugly cohorts cheered him on. I threw myself between them and struck Zulk squarely in his exposed crotch with my gloved fist. Despite the pain and embarrassment this caused him, he thought twice about striking back at me, as Theb was nearby and always had my back.
Zulk, you disgust me. How dare you?
I then yelled out as loud as I could, warning each one of them.
If any one of you worms ever lays a finger on this boy, I'll have your sack.
I drew my sharpest knife to ensure they all understood. Dan clung to me tightly, and I led him to my own chambers to keep him safe.
Worry not, young Dan. I won't let anyone hurt you here,
I promised him. As he clung tighter to me, I felt a strange sensation I hadn't felt in well over a century. Affection. I then remembered the touch of my mother, the feeling of loving and of being loved. I remembered the day she died. She was holding my hand when suddenly her grip loosened and she fell to the ground. So sudden it was, how she became completely still, without life. Her heart, after years of suffering, had stopped beating. I remember her hands and face became cold so quickly. I felt so helpless and so suddenly alone without her. Until that moment, with boy Dan attached to my hip, I had forgotten how much I missed holding another person, and how much I missed my human mother. Theb watched with disdain and disbelief as I took Dan, whom he referred to thereafter as
Seron de Ra,
your pet, to my quarters with me. I thought it best to let Dan stay with me in my private quarters for the time being, to protect him from these disgusting perverts. He wouldn't be safe sleeping amongst the rest of the drunken scum on the floors within the shady guild halls. But before allowing him in my comfortable bed, I needed to get him clean. He was filthy. So I bathed him. We had running water that we had tapped from an aristocrat's bathhouse high above us. Dan was very shy and demanded privacy of his nudity, which of course I granted him. But after he got in my tub and under the warm bathwater, he did allow me to help clean him as best I could. I then fitted him into one of my smaller tunics and leathers, and I allowed him to stay with me in my bed. Once again, as he lay beside me, he came closer. After some hesitation, I placed my hand gently on top of his head, touching his damp hair with my hand. When he finally fell asleep, I took great pride in having given young Dan some much-needed peace and comfort. I have never had a child, and I suppose this was as close as I ever came to feeling motherhood. But over the next few days, my pet did try to escape repeatedly. Despite my warmest affections, and try as I might to assure him that I'd help him get his commanded vengeance, he continued to try to find his way out of the maze of halls, tunnels, and rooms that was my subterranean guild fortress. Remarkably, he found one of our secret doors. But before he could leave through it, Theb trapped him with a holding spell. Though he wanted Dan dead for so many reasons, he brought the magically ensnared boy back to me.
Missing something?
He taunted in Elvish. Theb released him from his magic grip, and the frightened young Dan ran back into my lap and clung to me tightly. Theb then turned away, but not before shaking his head with disgust and motioning that he would slit the boy's throat next time. About a week later, I convinced Dan that I would allow him more freedom and time up among the humans if he helped me with a job. I explained what I needed him to do and promised him a generous amount of coin if it worked. He agreed. With that, Dan had joined my thieves' guild. In what seemed like a flash of passing time, he grew quickly into a vicious fighter and a very useful cover. He was ingenious in the art of deceit. He was also capable of defeating men-at-arms twice his age and strength through a natural talent for the sword and sometimes by uncanny sheer force of will. He was so innately lucky that we all began to wonder if he truly was blessed by his gods. His breathtaking beauty alone seemed to bespeak that. For these reasons, Dan was the only human who was ever allowed to be a certified member of my guild. He was branded for life with our guild symbol on his wrist. And he gained the respect of my crew very quickly. After a while, he seemed to be perfectly content hiding with us down below the city. He took naturally to the practice of thievery and adapted quickly to life among the non-humans. He was a useful diversionary tactic when we robbed the gold merchants, playing the lost boy who couldn't find his parents. He was equally useful when we conned the wine merchants of their wagons filled with southern vintages, playing the sole surviving victim of a brigand's raid. Dan was very convincing, All of this brought us much wealth, and for him, a very bad reputation among the humans. The Golden Boy Thief, they later called him. Needless to say, I did not ransom him off. I loved having him around. Despite constructing separate private quarters for him, I often let him sleep in my quarters beside me. I'd tell him stories and we'd discuss tactics. He was the perfect addition to my life. I cared for him, trained and loved him like the mother of an adopted child, at first. But later, as he grew, my attraction to him changed. I started to feel much more of an emotional and even spiritual connection to him. I didn't realize or understand it at the time, but I was falling in love with him. That was something I had very little experience with, being raised to adulthood by Theb Caru and his exclusively cold manner. Never one to congratulate, trust, or encourage. His ubiquitous disapproving gaze was how he taught me to protect myself in the violent underworld in which we lived. One night, after saving Dan's life in a violent scrap with a rival gang, Theb told him,
I don't understand why I feel compelled to help you, when I know I should just kill you or simply let you die. What magic do you use to make me do this?
It is the power of my God. He watches me always, and he controls your mind.
Dan smiled at Theb playfully while pointing to his head. Theb was not amused.
He does this because he wants to see my vengeance done, and you will help me. I have foreseen it.
The teen boy responded confidently.
Perhaps for a fee.
Theb responded without any expression. This notion Dan spoke of gods and visions interfering in the actions of men, befuddled Theb for years. I found it very amusing watching Theb observe and question Dan, trying unsuccessfully to figure him out. His remarkable luck and magnetic charisma confused him. Theb told me he was aware of these powers, how some humans claimed to be able to tap into the will of the immortals they worshipped.
But why would these immortals help one human worshipper and not another?
It made no sense to Theb why the gods clearly chose Dan. All the same, he suggested we should dispose of him several times over the years.
Before it's too late.
But each time, I vetoed. Theb agreed to accept Dan's continued presence, but only if it was certain to make us more money, which I assured him it would. Those were the happiest 7 years of my life. They went by so fast. But it wasn't long before Theb's stern warnings came back to bite us. As Dan grew bigger and stronger, and into manhood, his fateful attractiveness betrayed him. For women of all the most despicable types were drawn to him. It was useful at times. It was certainly why I spared him. But the captain's daughter, Tria, was another story. She was beautiful like Dan, but with a full, luscious human body that his eyes could not resist. She had numerous suitors, but none met her fancy. As daughter of the military captain of the keep, it was expected she would marry a man of distinction, one who would add to the upward elevation of her family's fortunes. Then she met Dan. Dan saw her, and she him, in passing on a city street during one of our operations. Rather than return to our base afterwards, Dan followed her home, like the lost puppy he was. He got her attention before she entered the security of the family compound.
Hey, what's your name?
Whispered Dan with an immaculate smile. Tria looked behind her, and then up to Dan. She smiled, enamored by his surprising entree.
Who are you?
And why are you on that rooftop?
The lovely girl responded with a smile. She resisted her mother's call to come inside, clearly intrigued by this handsome stranger.
Come with me, and I'll tell you. But I can't stick around here. Not allowed.
He said, reaching out his strong hand. Tria's mother came out to gather her daughter.
Tria, come in now. It's getting dark. I'll brush your hair before bed.
Her daughter looked up, then over to her mother. Then she looked up again. Tria's mother noticed as Dan's hand reached down to her. She looked to her mother, smiled, and then reached and grabbed for it, and then vanished upwards.
Tria!
Her mother screamed. But Dan and Tria were not alone. Pel Tavor, the military governor of this keep and lands surrounding it, had already placed a hefty reward on the head of the Golden Boy thief. One of my least trusted associates, a halfling named Uro, aimed to collect. And now that Dan was in possession of the most desired debutante in the Three Kingdoms, that price was certain to double. As the two teenagers scaled the city's rooftops together, Uro followed.
Where are we going?
Asked Tria, frightened and exhilarated at the same time.
I want to show you something,
said Dan as he boosted her up to the roof of the chapel. The spire was the highest point in the town of Bishop. When she climbed up, perilously, to the top, she turned and beheld the city from a view reserved only for winged creatures. Dan sat beside her.
So what do you think?
The two moons, pearly white Corla and the smaller pink and yellow moon of Elysia, were near full and glowed magically in the star-filled sky.
It's beautiful,
she exhaled. She reached over and pressed herself to Dan's body. She looked into his eyes.
Who are you?
Dan smiled, and before he spoke, Tria made a startling realization.
You! Yes, you're the Golden Boy thief,
she offered with a mix of fear and excitement. She knew if he meant her any harm, she was sure to die. She extended her arm to create an arm's worth of space between them.
Aren't you?
Well, that's what they call me.
He smiled back.
My name is Dan. Are you afraid of me?
She looked into his eyes and could not resist. She melted back into his arms. She was euphoric. Her dream answered. In a princess fantasy with her gallant hero, who had stolen her away from the hellish existence that was court in the backwater earldom of Bishop. As she looked beyond the nearly 2 full moons and growing visibility of the stars above, then to Dan's uncanny good looks, she felt warmness and excitement she could have only dreamed about an hour earlier. They giggled together while watching the clamoring guards that looked like ants down below, racing about the keep, looking for them. She did not want to leave him, ever. She looked again at Dan and they embraced with a passionate kiss.
How would you like to come with me? We could be free from all the rules and live any life we want.
Dan smiled.
No, how could I? My parents, they would be grief-stricken.
He kissed her again to stop her from speaking. The thought of leaving Bishop with Dan suddenly became the only option. She was in love. That is when Dan made the fateful mistake of impressing his girlfriend by bringing her home. The two of them slipped down a drainage pipe and whisked into the alley where our secret entrance lay.
Dan, what is this place? Where are we going?
Tria whispered. She was excited, but somewhat frightened now as well. Above them both, on a rooftop and unseen, was the thief Uro, who could not believe his good fortune. He had them.
Shen Shor Shira.
Dan spoke the elvish entry passwords. Tria was astonished as a passageway appeared like a mirage in the stone wall.
Come on, I'll introduce you.
Tria went with Dan reluctantly into the mysterious pass. When they appeared on the other side, the nearly 7-foot-tall half-orc god Zolk snorted and then bellowed loudly with disbelief.
Humans, not allowed.
He yelled and reached for his spiked club. Tria screamed. Dan reacted quickly, stomping on his foot. As Zolk reached to free his foot, Dan punched him in the face, flooring him.
Quiet, Zolk. She's with me.
The guard, now crumpled on his ass, snarled in response as blood dripped out of his pig nose.
Come on, Tria. Don't be afraid.
Dan's steel confidence was further fuel to the fire of love that was ignited inside her. Tria overcame her fear, took Dan's hand, and followed him into the dark corridor. Then he entered my guild hall, where I was distributing the booty of our latest heist. When I saw Dan, I smiled at him at first.
Where have you been? I thought you were right behind us,
I said. Then Dan motioned to someone else behind him, and she appeared from the shadows. My heart sank with disbelief. It was at that moment that I realized how much I loved him. A jealous rage and the shock of betrayal brought tears to my eyes for the first time in over a century. I was hardened and fierce. I did not cry. Well, not very often before then. But now I could not hold my emotions back.
Dan, what have you done?
Tears filled my eyes.
This is Tria.
He said with his patent, reassuring smile.
She is going to join us.
No, she isn't,
I said. Theb looked at me briefly with a searing, angry gaze, approached my side, and drew his sword. I did not know what to do next.
Dan, you killed this girl.
Tria gasped in fear. She clung to Dan, which only forced my jealous heart further into despair. Years of planning, my biggest dreams and most ambitious plots, all now ruined for the lust of one useless human girl. The irony of my own origins was crushing. As they moved closer with weapons drawn and encircled the human couple, Dan looked at the angry guild in disbelief. Zolk entered the room with a sneer, ready to get his payback for Dan's cheap shot.
Where is he?
And for years of unrequited animosity, his sarcastic taunts and blatant race hatred.
Wait, guys. No, really. She's okay. She's with me.
Dan, what's happening?
Time to die, boy.
As the crew of thieves and assassins drew closer, the unarmed Dan looked to me for mercy.
Aermine, do something.
It was at that very moment all was lost. A short sword popped out suddenly through the belly of Zolk. As he fell in agony, I saw the treacherous backstabber Uro behind him. After Zolk's huge body dropped out of the narrow hall, an armed garrison from the keep filled the void behind him. I raced over to collect my weapon, but Theb intercepted me. With a single word, prepared just for such an occasion, he teleported us both away. My last sight was of the frightened young Dan, now cut and bleeding, helpless and lost to me, for what I believed to be forever. My crew would fight bravely, but they would all be slain. None of the non-humans were spared. All non-humans were banned from the city shortly thereafter. The treasure I had amassed, the perfectly constructed hall, which took a century to build and endless gold coins to pay for, through the labor and skill of the conniving dwarves, was now compromised and lost as well. My guild was lost. Everything was lost. But what I dreaded losing most was my dream, for I was soon to enter my time of mating, and made myself believe that Dan was going to be my mate. He did not know it, but I had such plans. Now even he was lost to me. My heart sank lower than I ever felt it could go. Theb was furious. He barked at me in his harsh mountain dialect.
Prophecies, words for fools.
He stormed off towards the entrance of Cool Tebbet, the last remaining secret stronghold of the mountain elves. I remained behind, seated with my legs folded on that mountain top, shivering in the cold, relentless air. All I could think of was how to save Dan from the fate he had brought upon himself. But I was now more than 500 miles from there, and Theb would never agree to return to that place. I cried for days, it seemed, my sorrow echoing throughout the mountainous valley, until the inhabitants of Cool Tebbet could have no more of it. They covered my frozen body in blankets and carried me inside. It was there I slept for 5 years, through my time of mating, not knowing the fate of my beloved.